Hello crafty friends, it's Donna here, and I've got a little bit of a different video for you today. Normally I like to keep my videos to about 10 minutes, especially if I only have one card. But I thought that today we might have a little chat. Before we get talking, let's just have a little look at what's going to happen today. I have this Oh Christmas Tree stamp, which I'm going to stamp and colour. I'm also going to use this Victorian window die and one of the little rectangles that comes with it for my sentiment. I'm going to stamp on Express It blending card so that I can Copic colour, and I'm just using that window die to find my position before stamping with Memento ink. You can see me just putting my hand under the door of my stamping tool, and that's so that I can check that I've inked each part of the stamp up nicely. And the first inking is quite good, but I decided to go for a second one anyway. More is more, right? So what we're going to do today is I'm going to colour this in. I'll be showing you the markers on the screen. And since I've been missing in action for so long, I thought we might have a little bit of a chat about where I've been. So enjoy the colouring, and I'll just have a bit of a chat about what I've been up to. If you would rather just cut to the chase and see the card, you can head over to the Paper Rose Studio YouTube channel, where there will be a short version of this video without all the chitter chatter. If you're just here for the cards, that's fine. Head over to Paper Rose and get the quick version. Otherwise, settle in for story time. Many of you know that I lived in Japan for about 5 years. A lot of my videos allude to that, and you've probably seen me going shopping around Tokyo and living my life in Tokyo. And we've been back in Australia for about 18 months now. And I was missing Japan. It's been tricky settling back in, even though I love Australia and I love where I live. And one of the things that was really making me sad was the idea that I was losing my Japanese. I didn't have a lot of places here in rural Victoria to use my Japanese and to stretch myself. And so I hatched a plan that I would like to do some more study. And so I looked around at various university courses, and I didn't find anything that was postgraduate language study that I could do. I already have a Bachelor of Arts and I already have a graduate diploma, so I need something else to do. And I happened across a master's degree in interpreting and translation. So I'm going to take you back a few years to when we first arrived in Japan. I had been living in rural Victoria for approximately 15 years at that point, and I felt like my Japanese was getting quite rusty. And the beautiful city that I lived in, on the outskirts of Tokyo, had free language classes. Well, almost free. I think you paid like a few dollars a month just to pay for the electricity of the room we were using. And it was staffed one-on-one by Japanese nationals who volunteered to teach Japanese. And so I rocked up to this class, and they didn't have a spare teacher. But there was another girl at the classes who I knew, who they said, "I think you're about the same standard as her. Hop in with her." And as it turned out, she was studying for a Japanese proficiency exam, level 2. There are 5 levels of Japanese proficiency, and the bottom one is level 5, so it's 5, 4, 3, and at level 2, that is the level that you need in a lot of places to show that you have enough Japanese to get a job in a regular workplace, not as an English teacher or whatever, but to get a real job, but to get a job in a mainstream place in Japan. And so that seemed like a good plan. And so I started studying for that. And I studied like crazy. And I sat that exam. And I got through it okay at the end of that year. And when I finished that exam, I said, that's it. No more Japanese study in my lounge room for me. I'm living in Japan. If I'm going to learn Japanese, I'm going to learn it at cooking classes and at walking group, and I had 100 ways that I was going to learn Japanese. And I started to sign up for all of those at the beginning of 2020. And we all know what happened. By March of 2020, we were all staying home. And all of the things that I'd planned to do all got put on hold or cancelled, or I just couldn't attend. And so I was stuck at home with not a lot to do other than relearning how to knit. And so I thought to myself, I might just get the N1 kanji book. That's the script characters. I'm not doing the exam, of course, but I might just get one of the books, since I'm stuck at home anyway. And one book led to 2 books, led to 3 books, led to some pretty full-on study over the next while during those times of being stuck at home. And towards the end of my time in Japan, I went and I sat the level 1 exam. I thought it was going to kill me, but it didn't. I spent so much of my time in that year walking along the river by our house, studying. I put my flashcards onto my phone, and I don't know what everybody thought I was doing, but I was walking along the river, swiping left and swiping right, because that's what you do with the app, whether you know the word or not. So I don't know what they thought I was swiping on, but I was definitely studying vocabulary. So I passed my N1 and we came back to Australia. In fact, I didn't even know that I'd passed until after we arrived back, because the results took a while to come out. And that was that. It was done. Until 6 months later, when I decided that I might look into translation or interpreting. When I looked at the qualifications that you needed, I found out that you needed a master's degree. That suits me. I love to study. So I looked at the only university that's fairly easy to get to from my house, because I do live in rural Australia, but I am on a train line. And there was a course. But although it's not that difficult to get into the translation course, the interpreting side of things had extra requirements. And luckily for me, one of them turned out to be that N1 exam that I had sat in Japan not having any clue what it was for, and second guessing myself the whole time. Why am I even doing this? Well, it turned out I was doing it because it was what I needed. As well as that, I needed to interview and show them that my spoken Japanese was good enough, and they determined that it was. So I began my next round of university study. And this is the part of the story where we find out why I've been almost completely silent since March. My first interpreting class, I turned up, and the very first thing that we were given to interpret was a press release by Australia's Foreign Minister, which had been put out along with Japan's Foreign Minister on the palm process and some kind of bilateral agreement that had been reached on this process. I can't tell you how stuck I was. I was regretting every life choice I'd ever made. Other than the Australian Foreign Minister, I didn't know any of the people. I didn't know what the palm process was. I had no idea about diplomatic relations in that side of things. And I just thought I'd made a terrible, terrible mistake. And it occurred to me that while I did know a lot of Japanese, I didn't know a lot about politics, and I didn't know a lot about international relations, and I didn't know a lot of Japanese that was formal register Japanese. A lot of my time in Japan was spent shopping and playing and certainly dealing with things, but when my Japanese wasn't as formal, because I was the foreigner, they were just happy that I spoke Japanese. And so right from that first day, I realized that I had a big job ahead of me. And I really, really questioned the lady that said that my Japanese was good enough for me to do this course. And that was the beginning of getting up first thing in the morning and starting study, and studying until last thing at night, every day of the week, just to survive this course. It was so hard. However, much as the interpreting course was hard, that was where I learned all of my Japanese. And so I'm incredibly grateful for it, and I did back up and do it again in second semester. And I don't have my results back yet, but I believe I've survived. However, oh my goodness, what a year. I don't think I have ever worked so long and hard at something that I really didn't think I could do. I want to ask you a few questions now, and then I'll keep going. When I began at this course, I really didn't have a lot of an idea, even though I spoke 2 languages, about translation and interpreting. Do you know the difference? What makes something interpreting and what makes it translation? Have just a little think while I talk about the difference. Have a little think about what skills you think you might need to become an interpreter or a translator. Because the list was very different to what I thought, even with my 2-country experience and my 2-language experience. I've learned a lot, not just Japanese. So, an interpreter works verbally. If somebody needs help at the doctor's or the lawyer's or at the Social Security office, then that's where an interpreter might get called in. You might also find interpreters at conferences interpreting the speeches into a different language. And there's 2 ways you can do it. Simultaneous, where you listen as hard as you can while you speak at just the right volume that you can be heard, but you can still hear the speaker as they continue on. Or consecutive, where you listen to a chunk and maybe take notes, and then you have to reproduce that chunk in another language. But there's no gap from when they finish theirs to when you start. There's no chance to look anything up, to double check things. You just have to have all of that knowledge in your head. There's no opportunity to research. The other thing about interpreters is that we need to be able to go in both directions. So it's not enough to just understand Japanese. I need to speak it, and at the right level. Because if I'm there with a Japanese person and a doctor, or a Japanese person and a lawyer, I need to be able to represent both of them. So I need to speak both languages. And that's where the difficulty in that course is. Because every new word you come up against, you can't just jot it down for later. You have to stop and learn it. And there were a lot of words I didn't know. So it's been a great, great learning curve for me. As far as translation goes, translation is the written side of things. And you may still translate in a medical or a legal situation. You might be translating documents, for example. When we went to Japan and we needed to get our driver's licenses, we needed to have our Australian driver's licenses translated by a registered translator in Japan. So that kind of thing can happen as well. But there's a few big differences. The first one is that when you are translating, the normal thing is that you only translate into your mother tongue so that you can really work the nuances of the language that you're the strongest in. So already it's a different level of difficulty. Secondly, even when the timelines are very tight for translation, it's not 3 seconds. You might have 3 hours, you might have 3 days to do the translation. And so you have access to dictionaries, other resources, and all sorts of things. And that's really helpful. And so those units I didn't find so tricky. And I really enjoyed what I learned. So back to the second question. What skills do you need to become a good interpreter or a good translator? Obviously, you need good language skills in both languages. That much I had worked out before my course. You need good cultural skills. You need to know whether translating the words that you've just heard is going to be rude in the other language or is going to give it a slightly different meaning. So you need to be really, really comfortable in the cultures. That sort of made sense to me. But how from there can you make a whole master's degree? I thought. And then I learnt. There are so many things to think about. I'll give you an example. Let's say you're translating something about a native rainforest, and you come across a word that has several different translations. Some of them are more local to that area, and some of them are maybe more generic, more words that we would hear in our everyday English life. Which one do you choose? And this is where it got really, really interesting. If I am translating for a tourist brochure, I might use the local word because a tourist will want to go and have a really authentic experience and feel like they're living in that local or visiting that local area. So we would go with the local word. But if I were trying to rally up support for protecting that rainforest area, I might choose a more Western word if I'm translating into English, because if I use the foreign word, it might sound like this is a forest far away and nothing to do with us. And we might not be so encouraged to get involved with saving this rainforest. So I'll pick something that's quite local to the reader so that they will understand the problem, feel it's just like their problem, and be motivated to act. Every word has choices, and you have to kind of think about, well, what's my underlying plan here? How am I going to translate this? I found that so interesting. Here's another question for you that sounds very obvious, but turned out that it wasn't. Should I be translating the words in the original? It feels like the obvious answer is yes, doesn't it? But what if those words are, he's madder than a cut snake, or some other Australian saying, or what if it's a Japanese saying? What if it's a stitch in time saves 9? Well, we know what that means, but in Japanese, it might not have that broader meaning. It might just be something about sewing and about snakes. So I might not choose the words. Do I then go with the overall meaning or the individual parts and their meaning? And do I translate that? And the answer is maybe. But what if it's an advertisement that we're translating? Is our purpose to have the words moved into another language, or is the purpose to sell the product? And so we might need to go even further from the original text, because the purpose is not that people will understand the text, but they'll buy the soft drink or the jeans or the whatever it is. And so there's more to think about. And every week I turned up and we learnt something else, and I thought, oh, I never thought about that. It's a really, really interesting course. Anybody out there that speaks 2 languages and wants a whole lot of food for thought, highly recommend translation or interpreting courses. Just really interesting. As well as those basic theory of interpreting and theory of translation units, we did units with technology, and being the dinosaur that I am, I didn't know much about translation technology. And it turns out that AI is used quite a lot and machine translation is used quite a lot, but never as an end product. It's a way to get your rough draft typed in fast, basically. Because the AI still makes terrible, terrible mistakes. In my translations that I've been doing over the year, sometimes it will reverse the characters in a sentence so that the action's going the other direction. It misses things, it confuses who is who, it completely misinterprets things. A couple of times it even threw in a couple of Spanish words into my Japanese translation. So, AI is it's not the answer, but it was really interesting to learn about it as a tool. And I certainly learned about it as a way to start my inquiries. So, for example, if I'm doing something in a medical field and I need to know what is the professional word that's used in this context for this word, and I would ask ChatGPT and it would come up with an answer. One thing I've learned about AI is you cannot trust it as far as you can throw it. But at least it gives you a starting point. So then the next step is to go and look up that word that you've been given. But sometimes it would come up with absolute nonsense. And I would look and there'd be nothing, just nothing. And I'd go back and I would scold the AI because I'm a teacher and scolding is a thing. And I would say to the AI, that doesn't exist. I've looked it up. And ChatGPT would say, oh yes, you're right. Sorry, I seem to have made a mistake. And give me some other nonsense, which I could look up. And sometimes the second answer was correct. Usually it was also nonsense. So a lot of people sort of think, oh, well, can't you just use Google Translate? And the answer is absolutely not. You might be able to use it on a menu to get some kind of idea of whether you're going to be eating chicken or, I don't know, mushroom or whatever. But it's not really useful for real life translations. And in some ways, there is no true translation. Because when you think about it, I'm translating some words which really only represent somebody's ideas. So somebody had an idea and they captured it in some words. Then I take those words and in my head I get the idea and then I translate it into some other words in another language. The starting point was their idea, and that's what I'm trying to picture when I write my words. But any kind of artificial intelligence is only starting with the words. Artificial intelligence doesn't get the idea behind it. It just works in sets of words. So it's never going to get the concept. It's never going to be able to do the nuance, unless it's exactly the same nuance that somebody else used in an example that it's learnt and can reproduce. At this stage, that's just not the case. So there's definitely going to be work for real people in translation for quite a while to come, I think. Another subject that we did that was really interesting was ethics. Gee, I loved ethics so much. A lot of the ethics, there was a lot of reading on ethical principles, but a lot of that course was scenarios. Imagine that and then you had to say, well, what would be the ethical thing to do and why? And in Australia, we have a national code of ethics that we have to abide by as translators and interpreters. And lots of things that you think might be ethical or might be unethical aren't as clear-cut as you think. Here's an example. You turn up at a rally to interpret for the guest speaker, and it turns out to be some kind of vile hate rally, and you are the interpreter. And you didn't know that before you went, and now you're there and you can't believe your own ears. What do you do? There were lots of answers and lots of principles, and I'm just going to let you think on that one because it's tricky. Let me know in the comments if you've got any good ideas for these. Or you're an interpreter in a situation where one of the parties is making racist asides to you that they believe the client can't understand. What do you do? As interpreter, you're supposed to be impartial and right in the middle, not representing either party and you're supposed to translate everything. Do you translate the rude asides? What would you do? Do you think that the client, who maybe doesn't speak English, has a right to know that they're dealing with a racist service provider so that they can perhaps make another choice? Do you think it's unprofessional to do that? I'll leave that one with you. I'm not going to give you any answers. You have to think about it. So just lots and lots to think about. We did courses on something called transcreation. Tourism is an area that this happens in a lot. Advertising is another one. So let's say you've been given a tourist information website about an area in Japan or whatever country of the language that you speak. And they want to put an English page on their website. Do you keep all the same information or not? Or, given that the audience doesn't know Japan like the original Japanese language audience, do we perhaps need to add some information? Do we need extra pictures to support what the text is saying? Do we need explanations? Is there stuff that is just simply not relevant because we have a different understanding of the area? Or an example would be, in Japan, you might say, oh, this is a really popular spot. Lots and lots of people go here. And that might be a selling point for somebody who likes to go to the popular places. But your average Australian tourist wants to go and discover something for themselves, not to traipse with lots of tourists. So perhaps we highlight something else about the area instead. So much to think about, guys. So much to think about. Those translation units, with all of that time to think and to look things up and to justify why you've made that choice. You know, I chose this word because every assignment had an essay that went in with it. So you could justify why you had chosen the translation you did. I loved those, and they were no particular stress, but the interpreting. Right from that palm process that I mentioned early in the video, it's been hard. Nobody in Australia needs an interpreter to go shopping. And that's where my Japanese was at. They need them in all of these high-level, tricky situations. And we would cover one of these areas every week or 2 or 3. So it might be taxation this week and financial business the following week and domestic violence the following week. Lots and lots and lots of vocabulary, of learning about the system and how people can access it and how we can help people to access it, and lots of new words to be learned every single week. And so that side of things, the interpreting, is what's kept me holed up and unable to surface. Also, most of the assessment for the interpreting is not assignments that you hand in. A little bit is, but it is a stand and deliver type test where you walk in, you get given a speech and you have to give it in another language. Take notes and off you go. It's very much a performance exam. And the pass mark started at 65 and it moved up to 70, and it continues to grow as you get through the course. And so you can't just pass, you have to do really well. And fair enough. Nobody wants a medical interpreter that just scraped through and knows roughly half of what they need to. You know, you really do need to do well, and I get that. But that's what's added a lot of the stress. But that's what's made for so much learning. I've seen a diagram once of people who have you have your comfort zone, and then outside of that you have your growth zone, and then you have your panic zone. And I feel like I've had one foot in the growth zone and one foot in the panic zone all year. My friend described it perfectly when she said it's like drinking from a fire hydrant. The water's great, but it just comes at you at a very, very fast rate. However, here we are. We've reached the end of the year. I've been making cards and making videos and honestly pinging around like a pinball from one thing to another. I've got so much pent up activity that I've been waiting to do all year. It's a 2-year course, and so I still need to go back next year. The next semester starts at the beginning of March, but I have freedom until then, and I'm really enjoying it. And so it's actually been very nice for me to sit quietly and colour an image from start to finish, all in one sitting. You can see that I'm using some white gel pen just to add some sparkle and shine to those little baubles. You can also see that I have on very bright purple nail polish compared to my usual pale pink. That's because as part of my pinging, I've been trying to get the garden back on track, and that dark purple is hiding a multitude of sins. Those of you who've watched past videos will know that we try to grow our own food here, but I have sadly not even been out in the garden for 4 months, and so I'm trying to play a little bit of catch up. You'll notice too that as I do this colouring, I'm using the colours in several places. So once I've settled on that green for the tree, I also put it into her dress. And once I had some yellow for the baubles, I've used those colours as the light colours for the stool and her hair, and just added some dark colours along with them so that the image isn't too busy and scattered. I'm all about the peace and quiet at the moment. I'm just adding a little bit of rays coming out of this star. I wish that I had a warmer yellow that was this light, but I don't, so we've had to go with lemon yellow. Perhaps there was one, but I was too far into the colouring and too scared to try something different. Once all the colouring is done, there's just a tiny bit of colouring left to go. I'm going to put on the most peaceful YouTube music that I have, once again composed by my son Darcy. If you're keen to jump to the card construction, I'll meet you at the 35-minute mark. Otherwise, just enjoy a little bit of quiet music and a little break in your day. Welcome back if you skipped. Let's get on with constructing this card. I'm going to use the Victorian window die, and I've cut one from Kraft cardstock. This die cuts the window and also scores some little hinges, but I wanted the scoring to be a little bit deeper than what I'd done, and I didn't want to run it through my cutting machine again, so I'm just going through with my bone folder and my scoring mat, just to make sure that those doors will open nicely. And even with that window on the front, you can still see my coloured scene. I decided that I'd like a green sentiment, but I'm not sure what I want, so I've got two embossing powders here. Pink and Main Spruce It Up, which is a glitter embossing powder, and also Wow Metaline Kiwi Crush, which is just a regular embossing powder. I'm going to stamp in clear sticky ink. I'm using Versamark ink today, and I'm going to stamp at both ends of my paper because the ink will stay wet long enough to put the two different embossing powders on at the same time. I don't know if it's necessary, but I always double stamp for embossing. Once the stamping's done, I'll shake those powders, one onto each end. And as you can obviously see, that is the Japanese Teachers Association policy on human rights education. We all knew that, didn't we? I've heat set both of those embossing powders, and I actually really like them both. In the end, I've gone with the plain one just because it's such a thin line on the sentiment that the glitter made it a little bit less distinct. Also, in order to have the sentiment, which is on white paper, stand out against the background, I'm going to use one of the greens that I used to colour the tree, and I'm just going to run the brush end of that around the outside of my sentiment at a very slight angle so that there's a thin line of green, and that will border this sentiment so that it's not white on white. I'm going to glue the sentiment down and the window down with just a liquid glue. And when I'm doing the liquid glue, on these side bits which have opening hinges, I'm being careful just to put the glue only on the outside half. And then once that's all down, I have another piece of Kraft cardstock, and you can see here that the window opens to reveal the scene. Well done if you're still here. That was a long video, wasn't it? I've had to stop and get a cup of tea because my voice has nearly had enough of talking. I'll leave you with some close-up photos of the cards and a promise that I'll be back to my regular, short, sharp videos from next time. Thanks for joining me today and listening to me ramble. I'll be back soon with another card. Bye for now.